They say the lights flickered, just once, and when they looked up, Miss Calloway was gone. No sound, no struggle, just a steaming cup of coffee and an empty chair. It was a Wednesday. Not a remarkable one. The sky above, Dalton, Georgia, hung in its usual pale gray, the kind of color that made time feel slower, heavier. School had started like it always did, the bell blaring its synthetic shriek, students shuffling half-awake down polished hallways, the aroma of cheap cafeteria coffee trailing behind exhausted teachers. The hum of fluorescent lights filled room 3B, and in the middle of that room, Miss Calloway spoke about metaphor. If stories like this leave a shadow in your thoughts, you're not alone. Hit like if the mystery pulled you in, and subscribe if you're ready to keep digging, because some truths don't stay buried forever. She had a way of making silence feel meaningful. She would pause mid-sentence, hold the air like a ribbon between her fingers, her gaze drifting to the windows, as if seeing something none of her students could. They liked her, even if they didn't say it out loud. She wasn't like the others. She didn't demand attention, she invited it, gently. That day, her voice was soft as ever, reading aloud from The Fall of the House of Usher. Something about decay and madness, about walls that whisper. She said, "And sometimes the house is not haunted, it's waiting." A beat. Then, nothing. The classroom was still. Not the kind of stillness that comes from concentration, but something else. A stillness that felt too perfect, like sound itself had been sucked into the corners. A boy in the second row, Jeremy Tully, later said he felt a pop in his ears, like pressure dropping before a storm. A girl near the front, May Hartley, blinked, and in the blink, Miss Calloway was gone. Her chair rocked slightly, as if someone had just stood up. The book she was holding slipped to the floor without a sound. Her coffee sat untouched, steam spiraling upward like a ghost of breath. The board behind her still read, "Symbolism of the Unseen." For a moment, no one moved. The kind of confusion that doesn't immediately register as fear settled in. A few students exchanged glances. One laughed nervously, muttering, "Where'd she go?" Another stood and looked behind the teacher's desk, expecting maybe a prank, maybe a dropped pencil. But the door was closed. The hallway was empty. Security footage, what little there was, would later confirm what they all knew and didn't understand. Miss Calloway had walked into that room. But she had never walked out. When someone finally left to get help, the principal didn't believe it. Teachers searched bathrooms, offices, the parking lot. Her car was still there. Her phone was on her desk. A stack of ungraded essays, rubber-banded and untouched. They even checked the roof. That afternoon, a lockdown was declared. Students were kept in rooms. Police combed the building. Dogs were brought in. Rumors blossomed like mold in the absence of answers. Some said she ran away. Some said she was taken. A few whispered about that old story about Elias Parker, the boy who vanished in 1987. But what everyone remembers most wasn't what happened after. It was that moment, frozen in their minds. A room filled with living breath. A voice, half a sentence, a sudden absence. No flash, no noise, no sign. Just silence. And a chair slowly rocking, as though it still remembered she had once been there. Her name was Emily Calloway. The kind of name that sounds like a storybook character, soft on the tongue, quietly lyrical. In the tight-knit sprawl of Dalton, Georgia, she had lived a life that barely stirred the dust. She wasn't loud. She wasn't loud in the way people remember. But those who paid attention, the ones who sat in the front row, the ones who needed her, remembered her in glances, in gestures, in fragments that didn't seem important until she was gone. She moved to Dalton 7 years before the day she vanished. A transfer from somewhere up north. No husband, no children, just her and a Maine Coon cat named Sybil, and a car that always needed oil. Her neighbors said she kept to herself, but she always brought pumpkin bread during the holidays. Always smiled politely, always asked about your mother. And that was enough, in Dalton, to be considered kind. At school, she taught English junior and senior level, mostly. Literature, not language. She had a reputation for taking it too seriously, but not in the way that bored students. In the way that made them curious. She never handed out multiple-choice quizzes. She asked questions like, "What do you think guilt tastes like?" Or, "If loneliness were a color, what would it bleed?" She made the quiet kids feel loud without ever raising her own voice. And the loud ones, somehow, fell into silence around her. Not out of discipline, out of respect. She dressed like someone caught between eras, long wool skirts, soft cardigans, always in muted earth tones. Her hair, a deep chestnut, was always pinned back like she was trying not to be noticed. But she was. There was something cinematic about her. Like she belonged in a black and white film, the kind you find late at night, playing softly in an empty room. There were stories, of course, small-town stories, that she'd lost someone, that her brother had died young, that she wore his watch even though it didn't work. Some said she wrote poetry but never showed anyone. Some claimed she'd been engaged once, and that he'd left her at the altar. No one knew for sure. But you could see it, in the way she sometimes stared at the trees outside her window too long, or the way she would pause before answering personal questions, like she had to put something back in its box before she could smile again. She wasn't one for staff lounges or weekend barbecues. She declined invites gently, always with the same line, "Maybe next time." She walked the halls like a shadow, like someone who didn't want to disturb anything, yet left something behind wherever she went. Her classroom was filled with quotes pinned to corkboards, the kind of lines that make you feel seen. Students say her room always smelled faintly of sandalwood and old paper, like memory. When she disappeared, people remembered how little they knew. They pulled her yearbook photo and stared too long, trying to find answers in her expression. They interviewed coworkers who all said the same thing. She was kind, she was quiet, she was always on time. But she wasn't just a routine, not to everyone. May Hartley, one of her students, kept a journal. In it, she once wrote, "Miss Calloway is the only adult who ever looked at me like I was whole. Like I wasn't something broken trying to hide." Emily Calloway wasn't just a teacher. She was a whisper in a place that didn't know how to listen until the whisper was gone. She was a person made of softness in a world that mistook silence for emptiness. And then, one day, she vanished. And Dalton had to reckon with the truth it had long ignored, that you can lose someone completely, even if they were never loud enough to fill a room. They still talk about the chair. Not often, and not all at once. It comes up in pieces, in sidelong glances during reunions, in unfinished sentences over cigarettes behind gas stations. Those who were in room 3B that morning remember it differently, but always with the same image, the chair at the front of the class, swaying. A quiet motion that shouldn't have been possible. Not after she was gone. Jeremy Tully, who sat third row from the back, remembers looking up from his notebook just in time to see Miss Calloway pause. Her voice had that lilting rhythm she used when quoting Poe, like she was coaxing ghosts from the page. "And sometimes, the house is not haunted," she began. Then she stopped. He remembers the pause, how long it stretched. Long enough for him to lift his head. Long enough for his pen to stop moving. Long enough for something to feel wrong. She was mid-sentence. Then she wasn't. Kelsey Robbins, who had just transferred in that semester, thought it was a drill, or maybe a prank. Teachers didn't just disappear. She remembered thinking it was a performance, some elaborate metaphor. But then she noticed the coffee cup still on the desk. The steam rising, spiraling slowly, like nothing had changed at all. But something had. A few of them said the lights flickered, but no one can agree on when. Some said it was before she vanished, a brief stutter of fluorescent hum, a moment where the air felt thinner, like before a thunderstorm. Others insisted it happened after, in that confused, heavy silence. A flicker, like the room itself shuddered and held its breath. No one screamed. That's the part people outside the room never understand. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, unbearably so. The kind of quiet that wraps around you like water, thick and absolute. For a moment, it didn't feel like something had happened. It felt like something had been taken. There was no panic, just confusion, heads turning. A nervous laugh or two. Someone calling her name, Miss Calloway? In that drawn-out, uncertain tone usually reserved for when you think you've made a mistake. As if maybe she was crouched behind her desk, tying her shoe, or had stepped out without anyone noticing. But the door was closed. Locked from the inside, as always, the windows were shut. Her bag, untouched, her notes still on the podium, and the chair, that damn chair, gently rocking. The police asked questions. How long between her last word and someone noticing? Did anyone see a shadow? Hear anything? A creak, a gust of wind, the brush of clothing? But there was nothing. No sound, no sign of struggle, no misplaced papers or scuff marks or broken glass. Just the chair, just the steam from the cup, just a half sentence lingering in the air. Years later, students still get quiet when they talk about it. Some won't speak of it at all. May Hartley once said, "It wasn't like she left. It was like the room forgot she had ever been there, and we were the only ones who remembered." The school scrubbed the room clean within days, reassigned it, repainted it, removed the books, the quotes, the framed poster of Sylvia Plath that hung crooked behind her desk. But no one ever sat in that chair again. Not really. Even when someone else was teaching, even when the room was full, it felt vacant, like something was missing. Because something was. And the chair, even now, never quite stops moving. In the days that followed Emily Calloway's disappearance, Room 3B became something else, an exhibit, a wound, a question mark carved into the bones of the school. Yellow tape cordoned off the doorway like it was radioactive. Students whispered as they passed by, voices hushed not out of fear, but reverence, like something sacred had been lost. The police came fast, but their pace slowed almost immediately. There was no playbook for this. A person doesn't vanish mid-sentence with 30 teenagers watching and no one seeing. That wasn't how things worked. But when they pulled the security footage from the West Hallway camera, the one with a direct view of Room 3B's only door, what they found was worse than nothing. It was something impossible. At 8:14 a.m., Miss Calloway entered the classroom. She wore a brown cardigan, long gray skirt, her hair pulled into its usual low twist. She was carrying her messenger bag and a coffee cup in her left hand. She paused briefly outside the door, adjusting something in her bag, then went inside. The door closed behind her. And then, nothing. No one else entered, no one else left. Not at 8:15, not at 9 o'clock, not at 10:30 when the lockdown was declared. The footage remained steady, time-stamped and confirmed. No skipped frames, no interference. Just a still hallway, silent and bland, as though time had passed without participants. At first, the police assumed a technical failure. Cameras glitch, files corrupt. But the other hallways showed normal activity. Students coming and going, teachers chatting by lockers, janitorial staff pushing carts down linoleum tiles. Room 3B's camera wasn't broken. It simply bore witness to a door that opened once and never again. They checked every angle. There were no windows large enough for escape, and none had been tampered with. No fire exits in the room. No vents big enough for even a child to crawl through. The maintenance records confirmed. Room 3B had 4 solid walls and a single door. They brought in dogs, searched the building from foundation to roof. Every boiler room, crawl space, and maintenance tunnel. They even went so far as to scan the school's blueprints, decades old and yellowed, in case there had once been a forgotten passage, but nothing turned up. No secret corridor, no trapdoor. No underground access. Just the unyielding fact that a woman had entered a room and ceased to exist. The students were questioned one by one, all 32. Each had a slightly different version of that moment. Some noticed the flickering lights. Others insisted there hadn't been any. A few said they felt a sudden drop in temperature, or that the air seemed thick, electric. But none of them saw her leave. None of them heard a sound. And not one person could say what had happened between the last word she spoke and the moment they realized she was no longer there. The case was classified as a missing person, but in quiet tones, the lead investigator admitted it felt more like something else. "It's like a magic trick with no magician," he said. "Like she stepped out of reality and forgot to take the door with her." There were no signs of struggle, no fingerprints other than hers and the students'. No forced entry, no evidence, just that CCTV clip, a woman walking into a room where time collapsed. And somewhere, beyond the footage, beyond the explanations and logic, beyond the failure of every camera and every officer, a question began to grow. How do you vanish without a trace, when everyone is watching? He hadn't meant to stay after the bell. Detention was never part of his plan. But Kevin Albright had a talent for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that week it had cost him his Friday. Graffiti in the boys' bathroom his tag, they said, though they never proved it. So he sat alone in room 3B, long after the others had filed out, the shadows outside the windows already starting to lean long across the floor. It was 2 days after Miss Calloway disappeared. The school was still in a kind of suspended disbelief. Grief hadn't yet found its footing, because no one had really admitted she was gone. Missing, yes. Absent, yes, but gone? That was harder to say. Kevin didn't know her well. He wasn't the kind of student she paid close attention to. Failing grades, constant attitude, always showing up late. But still, she had once slipped him a copy of Mice and Men and said, "You might find yourself in this one." He never opened it. Now he sat in her room, and she wasn't there. The substitute had left him unsupervised, probably assuming he'd just leave early, but Kevin stayed. Not because he was obedient, but because something about the room felt off, still, too still. The desk was untouched, the same way they'd left it after the police had dusted for prints. Her belongings had been boxed up, but one thing remained, the blackboard. It stretched across the wall like a scar, smeared with the faintest traces of chalk. The cleaning crew had tried to erase the lesson, but some ghosts aren't wiped away so easily. You could still make out words beneath the residue, symbol, illusion, walls that breathe. Kevin tapped his pencil against the desk, rhythmically. Tried to pass the time, but his eyes kept returning to the board. At first, he thought it was his imagination. The way the dust moved under the old lights, the flickering in the corner of his vision. But the more he looked, the more certain he became. The board was shimmering. Not like a reflection, not like glare. It was subtle, like heat rising off pavement. The chalk marks seemed to ripple, just slightly, as if the surface were made of water rather than slate. Kevin stood, took a step closer. He remembers this part vividly. Years later, the feeling of the air in the room changing. Not colder, not warmer, just different. Like stepping into a space that wasn't meant to be walked through. He reached out, not sure why. Maybe curiosity, maybe something else. The moment his fingers hovered an inch from the board, the shimmer stopped. The air snapped back to normal, just a board again. Just chalk and smudges and nothing more. He didn't tell anyone. What was there to say? That a wall had looked at him strangely? That the air had felt wrong? They already thought he was trouble. He wasn't about to add crazy to the list. But when he turned to leave, something made him glance back. Just once. There, in the center of the board so faint it could have been nothing, was a handprint. Smaller than his. Faint. Pressed in the dust like it had reached out from the other side. And for a second, Kevin Albright felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt watched. And though he would never admit it to anyone, not even himself, he never stepped foot in that room again. Dalton, Georgia doesn't talk. Not really. It murmurs. It nods across pews and waves through windshields and leaves casseroles on porches when someone dies. But it doesn't talk, not about the wrong things. Not about the things that don't fit in the church bulletin or between the Friday night football scores. In Dalton, stories are sanded down before they're passed around. They're polished until they gleam with wholesomeness, until nothing sharp remains. So when Miss Calloway vanished, the town didn't know what to do with it. The story didn't fit. Dalton is a place of steeples and silence, of families who've been on the same land for 4 generations, of Bibles worn thin at the corners and diners that still handwrite orders on carbon slips. The kind of town where rumors grow legs fast, but only if they're the right kind. Gossip is currency, but truth is negotiable. A teacher disappearing in front of a room full of teenagers wasn't just tragic, it was wrong. It was unclean, and worse, it was unsolvable. That made it dangerous. In the first week, people asked questions, softly, carefully, over coffee at the Red Hen. After choir practice, did they ever find her car keys? Was she seeing someone? Maybe she just needed to get away. But after a while, the questions stopped, because the answers were either too frightening or too strange, and Dalton doesn't do strange. It does faith. It does forgiveness. It does forgetting. There were prayer circles. A vigil in front of the school that felt more like an obligation than an offering. A few news vans parked near Main Street for a couple of days, but the police gave them nothing, and the town gave them less. Parents pulled their children from interviews, the principal declined comment, and the church bulletin read, "Pray for Miss Calloway's peace, wherever she may be." It was the town's way of saying goodbye without saying it out loud. Her house was put up for sale before the school year ended. A real estate sign hammered into the dry earth like a tombstone. No one bought it for years. They said it was because of the market, but everyone knew better. The windows stayed dark. The wind chimes never rang. Her cat, Sybil, had to be rehomed by the vet. People moved on, or pretended to. The school scrubbed her name from the faculty list. Her books were boxed up. Her classroom was reassigned to a substitute no one bothered to learn much about. The desk stayed, though. And so did the feeling, if you stood still long enough in the hallway outside. Room 3B, the sense that something had been opened and never properly closed. Dalton's silence is not the absence of noise. It's a decision. It's a folding inward. A slow, deliberate erasure of things that might cause discomfort or doubt. And Emily Calloway, for all her soft edges and polite smiles, had become one of those things. A thread too tangled to unspool, a mystery that refused to fade cleanly into myth. So they left her out of the story, because in Dalton, you don't speak of what you cannot explain. You bury it, you bless it, you move on. But some people don't forget. Some people don't forgive the silence, and in a town that doesn't talk, the truth waits in the walls, in the corners, in the space where a story was supposed to be. When the doors to room 3B finally opened again, the air inside was stale, still touched by something that didn't belong to time. For weeks, the room had remained sealed, the blinds drawn, the desks collecting dust as if in mourning. The janitors had swept, the maintenance crew had come through twice, and the principal had signed off on its return to the rotation. A new teacher was assigned. Fresh lesson plans were printed. Everything was meant to go back to normal. But something didn't. It started as a small thing. A faint gray blur on the left side of the blackboard. Nothing dramatic, just a smudge. It looked like the residue of old chalk, maybe the edge of a palm brushing against words once written and now forgotten, the kind of mark that would have gone unnoticed in any other room. Except this wasn't any other room. The first substitute to step foot in 3B after Miss Calloway's disappearance was a man named Mr. Brandt, retired early from Atlanta, called back in on short notice. He taught for 3 days before quietly requesting a different room. Said the board was uncooperative. When pressed, he said it in a half-joking way. But his tone didn't quite match the words. The mark would be wiped away every morning. He used the eraser. He used water. Once, he even used vinegar. But each day, it returned. Faint at first, then darker, wider. Like it was seeping back through the slate, not laid on top but emerging from beneath. Other teachers noticed. Miss Duncan from the science wing borrowed the room once for overflow testing. She made a comment in the break room afterward, something about a bruise on the board that won't go away. That's how people started referring to it. A bruise, not a stain, not a shadow, a wound. Maintenance was called again. They replaced the erasers, switched out the cloths, even scraped the surface lightly and repainted the board with fresh matte black. For a single day, it looked perfect. The next morning, the smudge was back, same place, same shape. It was not shaped like a word. It wasn't a symbol, either. But some said if you stared long enough, it looked like a figure, a curve, a shoulder, maybe, a head slightly bowed. Others said it resembled a door. Not open, not closed, just ajar. Students who had known Miss Calloway avoided looking at it. New students didn't notice, at first, but even they began to whisper. About headaches. About strange static when sitting in the front row. About a humming sound that couldn't be located. Some said they saw something move in the board's reflection, but when they turned, no one was there. By mid-semester, Room 3B had earned a reputation. The administration didn't acknowledge it, of course. That's not how Dalton worked. But quietly, a decision was made. The room would be reserved only for in-school suspension or testing overflow. No one would teach there full-time again. The mark remained, persistent, passive, waiting. And though everyone stopped trying to clean it, someone, maybe the janitor, maybe not, still left a rag on the windowsill. Folded neatly, as if in quiet surrender to something that would not be erased. Like a memory that refuses to fade. Or a secret that has already learned how to speak without sound. 3 years passed, and the town of Dalton, Georgia, did what it does best, it forgot. Not all at once, not in a cruel or deliberate way. Forgetting in Dalton is quiet. It seeps in slowly, like fog rolling over a cemetery, blurring the names until even the gravestones look like mistakes in the landscape. By the time the last class of students who had been in room 3B walked across the graduation stage, Miss Emily Calloway had been folded into the town's unofficial history. An absence, rather than a person. Her name no longer spoken in faculty meetings. Her photo removed from the yearbook archive. Her classroom repurposed, though never fully reclaimed. Room 3B still smelled different. Still held a hush in its corners. But even that was beginning to fade. May Hartley didn't forget. She tried. She really did. The first year, she carried Miss Calloway's old copy of Wuthering Heights in her backpack like a talisman. The second year, she stopped mentioning her name out loud. People got uncomfortable when she brought it up: friends, teachers, even her parents. Her mother once told her, gently, over dinner, "Some things just don't get solved, May. Doesn't mean you have to carry them." But May had always carried things. Quietly, steadily, like her bones had been built with an extra shelf just for sorrow. And Miss Calloway wasn't just a mystery to her. She had been something solid in a world that often felt like it was built on sand. They weren't close in any traditional sense. May wasn't a straight-A student or a teacher's pet. She sat in the second row from the back, took too many notes, and didn't speak unless called on. But Miss Calloway saw her. Not just in that surface way adults sometimes pretend to. She saw her, recognize the silence not as indifference, but as weight. She once wrote in the margin of one of May's essays, "You don't have to be loud to be powerful." May never showed it to anyone. She just folded the paper and kept it, pressed flat inside the pages of an old novel. So when the case grew cold, when the detectives stopped calling, when the media turned their cameras away, when even the gossip dulled into apathy, May stayed tethered. She watched the board in room 3B every time she passed it in the hallway. Still marked, still smudged, still wrong. No new leads surfaced. The CCTV footage was archived, reviewed 100 times, and still offering nothing. The town moved on. A new mayor was elected. The high school football team won regionals. The annual fair expanded to include a haunted house. May walked past it that year without stopping. She didn't need to pay $5 to be scared. Something about the whole thing never sat right. It wasn't just the vanishing, it was the way everyone had swallowed it whole and decided it wasn't poison. May began keeping a journal. Notes. Newspaper clippings. Names. She even wrote to a podcaster once, someone who covered disappearances. They never responded. But she kept going. Because the silence wasn't just frustrating. It was unnatural. People don't just disappear. And when they do, someone, somewhere, always knows more than they say. May didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in echoes. And in Dalton, where everyone had learned to live with forgetting, she chose to remember. Because May Hartley wasn't done with room 3B, not yet. It happened on a Thursday. Late enough in the year that the sun bowed out early, casting long blue shadows across the empty school grounds. May Hartley waited until the janitorial staff took their smoke break by the gym loading dock. She knew their routine. It hadn't changed in years. Same corner, same time, same laughter through clenched teeth. It gave her exactly 12 minutes. The door to the East Wing stairwell had always stuck. She'd tested it weeks earlier, nudging it open with a folded library card and a firm push. Now it opened with the same reluctant groan, as though the building itself didn't want her to be there. The halls were still. Familiar. Cold. Locker doors glinting like teeth in the low emergency light. She moved quickly but silently, keeping close to the wall, her sneakers making soft, measured contact with the wax tile. Room 3B was locked, as she expected. It had been kept closed for maintenance, that semester at least. That was the official story. But May knew better. No one wanted to be in that room. No one wanted to talk about why. She slid a bent paperclip into the lock, hands steady. It clicked open too easily, like the door was just waiting to be used again. She stepped inside. The scent hit her first. Faint but distinct dust. Aged paper. Something almost floral beneath it. Not perfume. Not air freshener. It smelled like memory. The overhead lights didn't work. She didn't try them. Instead, she pulled a small flashlight from her jacket and clicked it on, casting a narrow beam across the empty desks. Everything was exactly as it had been. The same chalk tray. The same stack of faded composition books in the back corner. The same heavy silence, wrapped around the room like a shroud. And then she turned to the board. It was still marked, the same bruised smudge that had lived there for 3 years. But now beneath the dust, beneath the layers of time, and forgetting, something else flickered into view under the light. At first she thought it was just residue, chalk outlines that never fully faded. But then her breath caught. Because it wasn't random, it wasn't just marks. It was writing. Faint, so faint she had to step closer, angling the beam of her flashlight at a low angle, letting it rake across the surface. The words weren't written in fresh chalk. They'd been buried, pressed under layers, scrubbed over, maybe deliberately. But they hadn't disappeared. They buried the truth. Beneath the wood. May stared. The letters were slightly uneven, shaky, as if written in haste or fear. She ran her fingers gently along the lines, felt the ridges of the strokes that shouldn't have still been there. She didn't know how it was possible. She didn't care. All she knew was that someone, maybe Miss Calloway, maybe not, had left a message. one no one else had bothered to look for. She stepped back, heart pounding, the silence of the room suddenly thick again. Not oppressive, not malevolent, just expectant. As if something had been waiting for her. The chalkboard no longer looked like a board. It looked like a map. May turned off the flashlight, stood in the dark for a full minute, and whispered one word to the empty room. "Why?" And in the silence that followed, she thought just for a second, she heard chalk dragging slowly across slate. May didn't sleep that night. She went home with her phone clenched in her palm, fingers trembling slightly from adrenaline or fear, she couldn't tell which. On the surface, the photograph looked like nothing. A dusty, scratched blackboard barely visible in the dim flashlight beam. But May had learned to look deeper. She opened the image on her laptop and began adjusting the contrast, isolating shadows, stretching the grain. She wasn't trained in forensics or photography, but obsession makes you resourceful. She remembered something from a documentary about old letters, how certain inks only revealed themselves under different spectrums of light. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out the tiny blacklight keychain she used at thrift stores to check antique bills and glassware. Not exactly professional gear, but it would do. She shined it on the photo displayed on her screen, watching how the purples and blues played across the image, eyes narrowed for movement in the stillness. And then there it was. The sentence revealed itself like breath on glass, thin and ghostly, but unmistakable. Glowing faintly under the ultraviolet haze, like it had waited in silence for someone to know how to see it. They buried the truth. Beneath the wood. May froze. It was the exact phrase she'd seen faintly on the board with her own eyes in the classroom. But now it was sharp, deliberate, as though the board itself had spoken it in writing that only time could unlock. She ran the image through an inversion filter, watching as the blacks turned to whites, the smudges to scars, and the writing bled into full clarity. It wasn't chalk, not regular chalk. It had settled under the surface, layered beneath years of cleaning, as though whoever wrote it had found a way to hide it inside the board, not on top of it. May's heart beat faster. She scrolled through old screenshots from the school's security archives, one she'd pulled from public records months ago. She zoomed in on room 3B's board, frame by frame. Nothing. Not even a smudge. Which meant one thing. This message hadn't been there before, not like this. Someone had added it. Recently. But the classroom had been locked for months, left unused since the maintenance closure. No teachers assigned, no janitors scheduled to clean it more than once a week. And the cameras in that hallway, just like 3 years ago, had shown no one going in, no one coming out. May stared at the screen. 1,000 thoughts pressed against the edge of her mind, trying to get through. Who had written it? Why now? And what did it mean beneath the wood? Her eyes drifted to the edge of the image, the faint outline of the classroom's wooden floor, dull and uneven in places, long boards that creaked when stepped on. She remembered how Miss Calloway's podium had always sat slightly tilted, one leg lower than the others. How she would rest her hand there sometimes, as if to steady herself. May opened a new folder on her desktop and labeled it Calloway, hidden. She saved the image, backed it up twice, printed a hard copy and tucked it into the back of her notebook. A feeling was rising in her, not fear, but something adjacent. Anticipation. Like she'd pulled a thread she didn't realize was connected to something massive. And now it was unraveling. She looked at the photo one last time before closing her laptop. That single sentence still glowed faintly in her vision, etched onto the backs of her eyelids like a warning. Or a map. Or both. They buried the truth. Beneath the wood. Whatever this was, it had waited long enough. The basement of Dalton High wasn't meant for visitors. It smelled of damp concrete and forgotten paper, the kind of place where old things went to lose their names. May had only been down there once before, years ago, on a class errand. But now she moved through it with purpose, flashlight in hand, the silence pressing in around her like wet cloth. She found the furniture storage room at the far end of the hall, past stacks of broken chairs and outdated projectors, where the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. A metal rack of file cabinets lined the wall, but it was the far corner that caught her eye. Wooden desks piled in crooked layers, chipped and weathered, all bearing the same decades-old varnish. She recognized it immediately. The second one from the bottom, a deep walnut grain, the brass drawer handles dulled by time. Miss Calloway's desk. It looked smaller down here, like memory had inflated it over the years. She ran her hand along its surface, dust trailing behind her fingers like smoke. The drawers stuck at first, but opened with enough force. Empty, just splinters and forgotten staples. All except the bottom one. That one didn't budge. May crouched, examining the edges. It looked flush, but something felt wrong, like the drawer wasn't real, or wasn't complete. She tapped it, listening to the echo. Hollow. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a thin metal ruler, and began probing the seams. There, a soft click, barely audible. The panel shifted. A false bottom. Inside was a slim leather-bound notebook, brittle at the spine. Beneath it, a cluster of papers, yellowed lesson plans written in Miss Calloway's tight, looping script, and folded between them, a piece of thick parchment. Not standard school paper, older, smoother. It had been folded into quarters, and when May opened it, her breath caught in her throat. It was a map, hand-drawn, a sketch of the school grounds from an aerial view. The gym, the auditorium, the west wing. And behind the gym, in what was now a fenced-off utilities area, a small square was marked in red pencil. An X. As plain and deliberate as anything she'd ever seen. May stared at it, feeling the weight of the moment settle onto her shoulders like a shroud. Miss Calloway had hidden this, on purpose, which meant she had known something was there, something important. And she hadn't trusted anyone with it, not the administration, not the police. Only the drawer that was never meant to be opened. She turned to the journal. Its cover was worn, the spine loose, the pages brittle. Inside were entries that blurred the line between observation and confession. Thoughts on literature, fragments of poetry, reflections on her students. But then, toward the end, May saw it. The tone shifted. The writing grew sharper, anxious. Phrases like, "They're watching," and "beneath us," always beneath, dotted the margins. One page simply read, "The school was built on something it shouldn't have been. I've seen it. I've heard it. No one will listen." May closed the journal slowly, her hands numb. This wasn't just about a disappearance anymore. Miss Calloway hadn't vanished without a trace. She'd left something behind. A trail. A voice inside a drawer waiting to be heard. And now May had the map. The X. Whatever lay behind the gym, it was buried. Hidden, forgotten. Just like her teacher. But not for long. The ink told the truth long before the words did. May sat cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom. The journal spread open before her, like an artifact exhumed from beneath the soil. She turned the pages slowly, careful not to let the brittle paper tear, the corners worn soft by hands that had once trembled with thought. Miss Calloway's handwriting was elegant, but hurried in places, like someone trying to outrun the very thoughts she was recording. At first, the entries were unremarkable. Lesson outlines, book quotes, fragments of analysis, symbolism and Plath's mirror confrontation with the self. Othello's silence carries more weight than Iago's speech. Observations on students, all anonymized. May even found herself, described only as the quiet one who understands more than she lets on. It should have made her smile, but the deeper she read, the heavier it became. The tone shifted midway through the journal. The margins began to fill with short, disjointed thoughts. Worry lines. Repetitions. Something is wrong with the floor. He was in the room before I arrived. He said he was checking vents, but there are no vents. They always have a reason. None of them make sense. May turned the page and found an entry marked with a smeared ink blot at the top, as though Miss Calloway had pressed her pen too hard into the paper. The 9th of February. The lights flickered again during fourth period. I've asked the custodial staff. They say it's old wiring. But the flickering only happens in my room. Only when I'm alone. I've stopped asking questions. They don't answer anymore. They look at me like I'm interrupting something. May underlined that sentence with her finger. There were notes about a man she never named. Someone who showed up during faculty meetings, who never spoke, who always stood just behind Principal Morrison with a clipboard he never seemed to write on. Miss Calloway wrote about the way he watched her. About how he once followed her out to the parking lot and said, smiling, "We appreciate your dedication to the students, but some things are best left untouched." The entries grew more erratic after that. I tried to report it. No one followed up. One counselor told me to take a few days off, clear my head. But the dreams are worse at home. I hear scratching now, beneath the floorboards. Sometimes I feel like the classroom is breathing. May felt the chill crawl up her spine, but she kept reading. There's something beneath the building. Beneath room 3B. Not in the basement. Deeper. I found the old blueprints. There's a sealed space under the original foundation. It was never filled in. They just built over it. The school doesn't want anyone to know. I think someone went down there once and didn't come back. The final entry was written in smaller handwriting, uneven and slanted as though she'd scribbled it in haste. If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. They'll call it a disappearance, but it isn't. They don't erase people, they bury them, they bury the truth, and they're watching now. I can feel it when I teach, when I sleep. Even as I write this, especially now. May sat in the silence of her room long after the final word faded from the page. The journal didn't just tell a story, it was a scream too quiet for anyone to hear when it mattered. But May was listening now. And someone had tried very hard to make sure no one ever would. The ground behind the Dalton High Gymnasium was uneven, sloping slightly toward the rusted chain-link fence that marked the edge of the property. No one came out here anymore. The school had fenced it off years ago, citing drainage issues and unstable soil. Tall grass grew in patches like tufts of hair on a balding scalp, and the concrete foundation near the back exit of the gym was cracked and discolored, like something had tried to push up from underneath. May had waited until dusk. She wore dark clothes, hair tied back, gloves already on. The map had been clear beneath the wooden planks of the old equipment access, just past the east corner of the gym. A space that had once led to crawlspace storage before it was sealed and forgotten. Most of the newer students didn't even know it existed. She worked quickly, hands shaking not from fear, but purpose. Her heart pounded like a metronome out of rhythm. The rotted edge of a plank gave way under her weight, and she crouched down, pulling away loose boards one at a time. The flashlight's beam trembled in the dark as she peered beneath the floor. It wasn't deep, just enough space for a crawlspace, and even then, barely. The earth below was compacted and dry, disturbed in a way that didn't look recent but not untouched, either. Someone had been down here before, a long time ago. May crawled in, her breath loud in the tight enclosure, the ceiling just inches from her back. The air smelled of mildew and iron. After about 6 feet, her hand struck something hard, metal. She cleared the dirt with slow, deliberate sweeps, revealing the edge of a small rusted box, about the size of a toolbox, bolted shut but weakened with age. It took effort, and the edge of her screwdriver, but eventually the lid groaned open with a reluctant pop. Inside, time had been waiting. There were 2 film reels, sealed in faded canisters. No labels, just worn stickers with long faded writing. Beneath them, wrapped in what looked like an old gym towel, was a scarf once white, now stained deep brown at one end. May didn't need to test it to know what it was. The discoloration had soaked through the cloth like ink in paper. It had dried, yes, but the truth of it hadn't faded. At the bottom of the box lay a student ID. The plastic was warped with age, the photo a little water-damaged, but still visible. A boy with sharp eyes, dark hair, a slight, hesitant smile. Name: Elias Parker. Graduation year: 1988. May stared at it, her breath caught in her throat. Elias Parker had disappeared in 1987. The school said he transferred. The town had shrugged and moved on. No investigation, no posters, just a gap in the yearbook and a story that stopped being told. But this wasn't a transfer. She sat back on her heels, the box open in front of her like a coffin. The soil beneath her knees was colder now, the crawlspace tighter, the shadows darker. She felt it, not just the weight of what she'd uncovered, but the certainty that something was unraveling, just as Miss Calloway had feared. Something old. Something the school had built over but never truly buried. The gym lights flickered above her, faint and distant through the cracked wood. May didn't flinch. She looked back at the film reels, the scarf, the ID. They had buried the truth. But now, the ground had given it back. The discovery of Elias Parker's student ID card cracked something open, not just in May's understanding of what had happened to Miss Calloway, but in the foundation of the town itself. Up until now, the story had lived in the present, haunted by a recent silence, anchored in the lingering shadow of a beloved teacher. But now the shadow stretched backward, 38 years into the past, to a boy who had disappeared without the world seeming to notice. May didn't remember the name. Why would she? Elias Parker would have been just another line in a long-forgotten roster, a face in a yellowed yearbook she'd never seen. But the ID didn't lie. It was real. And the dried blood on the scarf folded beneath it whispered a truth no school record ever had. She went digging. The library still kept the old yearbooks in the back office, filed neatly in cracked binders with decades stamped in fading gold. May asked to see the 1987 edition, claiming a history project. Though the librarian barely looked up before waving her through, no one was paying attention. That was the thing about Dalton. It didn't watch closely when it didn't want to see. She flipped through the pages, rows of feathered hair and collared shirts smiling stiffly at the camera, a sea of forgotten names. When she reached the juniors, she slowed. There he was. Elias Parker. Second row, third from the left. Same face, younger than the ID photo. The kind of face that doesn't scream to be remembered, slim, quiet, unremarkable at first glance. But his eyes were alert, watchful. The caption beneath just read, E. Parker. She checked the next year's edition, class of 2088. But he wasn't there. Not in the senior portraits, not in the candids, not in the clubs or sports. His name didn't appear in the list of graduates. It didn't appear anywhere. Just gone. She scanned the local papers from that summer. No missing persons report, no obituary, no transfer notice, no parent interviews. It was as if Elias Parker had been quietly folded out of existence. And yet, there had been a student. He'd attended classes. He had an ID. He had a place in the hallway photos. But then, one day, nothing. May returned to Miss Calloway's journal. Flipping back through the later pages, she noticed something she hadn't the first time. A half sentence in the margin of a longer entry. He found it first. That boy in the old records. Elias, they said he transferred. But I saw his name on the original reports. I saw the red ink. The words hit like a current. Miss Calloway had found him. She'd uncovered the same name, the same gap in the school's timeline. She'd seen something in the records, perhaps in the dusty archives stored beneath the main office, or in the principal's locked file drawer. Wherever it was, it had led her to Elias, and it had terrified her. Because Elias hadn't transferred, he had vanished, just like her. And the school had written him off with a line, a lie, and a practiced shrug. May understood now that this was never just about Miss Calloway. It was never just about a smudge on a chalkboard or a journal filled with fear. This had happened before. And if it had happened twice, it meant it could happen again. Dalton High hadn't forgotten Elias Parker. It had erased him. The blueprints were buried deep in a filing cabinet labeled Structural Archives, 1970-1995. May found them in the school district's records office, a squat brick building across town where dust settled like tradition and paperwork went to sleep. She had requested them under the pretense of an architecture paper, something vague and convincing enough for the clerk to wave her toward the back without suspicion. The pages were brittle with age, rolled tightly and secured with a rubber band that had fossilized into a brittle loop. She unrolled them slowly across the table, weighting the corners with her phone and water bottle, revealing the skeletal anatomy of Dalton High. Most of it was familiar, wings marked A through D, the gym, the auditorium, the central stairwells that had never quite stopped creaking. But the blueprints from 1984 dated just before a major renovation told a different story. There, beneath the west wing, beneath room 3B, was a small rectangular chamber, labeled simply as Sub-Basement Storage 3B. No square footage noted, no ventilation, no secondary egress. Just a box drawn in ink beneath the heart of the school. May traced the lines with her finger. In the 1991 blueprints drawn post-renovation, the room was gone. Not repurposed, not remodeled, erased, as if it had never existed. No mention in the notes, no reclassification. Just blank space where a structure had once been. She scanned the blueprint again, and that's when she saw it faint handwriting in the margin, barely legible. Secured, interior lock only. Do not unseal. The letters were slanted, almost hurried, written in pencil that had nearly faded with time. An interior lock. May's pulse quickened. Whoever had sealed that room hadn't intended for anyone to enter, but someone had been inside, and they had locked it from within. She copied the plans with her phone, taking picture after picture until every detail was preserved. Then she went back to the school. Not the next day, but that night. It had started to rain, and the parking lot was an ocean of reflections, the building casting long, ghostly shapes in the water. She knew the janitors wouldn't be around, the power had gone out earlier that week, and cleanup crews were only scheduled in the mornings now. Room 3B greeted her like it always did, silent, expectant. She stepped inside and stood there for a long moment, letting the stillness press against her skin. She knew where to look now. At the back of the classroom, beneath the cabinet where Miss Calloway used to keep extra copies of reading lists and tattered dictionaries, the floorboards creaked with a different sound. Hollow. May knelt and tapped. Once. Twice. The third time, it echoed faint, but clear. Something was below. She searched the perimeter, but there was no visible access panel, no hinge, no handle. The renovations had done their job. The room had been sealed like a crypt, but not before someone had gone down. May pressed her hand against the floor, fingers splayed across the old wood, damp with years of wax and footsteps. Somewhere beneath her, past the locked silence and the blueprints meant to erase, was a room no one wanted to admit had ever been built. A room that wasn't supposed to exist. And someone had made sure it stayed that way. From the inside, the film reels had sat on May's desk for days before she found the courage to touch them. Every time she passed by, their metal canisters seemed to pulse with quiet menace, like heartbeats encased in steel. They felt old not just in years, but in presence. Ancient in the way forgotten things become when left to rot beneath the floorboards of places that pretend they're clean. She found an old projector at a thrift store 2 towns over, paid in cash, didn't give a name. Back in her room, curtains drawn, lights off, She fed the reel into the machine with careful fingers. The gears clicked into place, the motor whirred to life, and the film began to turn, light flickering against the wall in fits and spasms. There was no picture, only static. At first, May thought the film was damaged. A blur of grays and whites danced across the wall, lines of interference twitching like veins. But then the sound crackled through the old speaker, thin, hollow, like it had traveled through time with too much weight on its back. And then a voice. Faint, muffled, but undeniably human. It was Miss Calloway. Her cadence was unmistakable, measured, soft, like someone reading to a child on the edge of sleep. The words came slowly, each syllable wrapped in trembling breath. The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. May recognized the line. Edgar Allan Poe, The Premature Burial. She had heard it before, in room 3B, 3 years ago. Miss Calloway had taught that story during fall semester. But here, her voice was different, less structured. It wavered as if she were trying to remain composed, but something around her was fraying. There were whispers in the background, low, indistinct. Not another language, not quite, but wrong. Like a memory being spoken by something that had never lived it. Who shall say where the one ends, and where the other begins? The whispers grew louder. They overlapped, forming a static chorus like children speaking underwater, like wind through broken glass. May leaned in, her breath held. She couldn't make out words, just emotion, pleading, warning, waiting. Then, suddenly, Miss Calloway's voice broke mid-sentence. A pause, a hitch in her breath. And then screaming. It wasn't theatrical, it wasn't composed, it was raw, primal. The sound of someone who had reached the bottom of something deep and unnameable. It echoed through the projector speaker like it was coming from beneath the floorboards, clawing its way into the room. Then, silence. Not static, not distortion. Just silence. The reel continued to spin for another minute, but no sound followed, no voices, no whispers. Just the mechanical whir of the projector and the ache in May's chest. She sat frozen, the sound still echoing in her bones. The scream had not come from someone afraid of dying. It had come from someone who had seen what waited past the veil and realized no one would believe her. May rewound the film slowly, hands trembling, and returned the reel to its box. She didn't watch the second one, not yet. Some truths don't arrive all at once. They come in pieces, in voices, in dust. And now, one of those voices had come back, not to haunt, but to be heard. The morning May uploaded the files, Dalton was still asleep. She sat at her kitchen table as the sky outside softened from black to ash gray. Her laptop open, the cursor blinking like a warning. The files were ready: scans of the journal pages, photos of the blueprint, the recovered footage of room 3B, and the digitized audio from the reel. No embellishments, no commentary. Just the truth, raw and unfiltered, uploaded in a single folder titled What They Buried. Within minutes, it began to spread. By noon, it was everywhere. The reaction came in waves. At first, disbelief. Commenters assumed it was fiction, a cleverly staged hoax. But then people started recognizing names, recognizing places. Students who had once sat in room 3B spoke up. Quiet messages appeared in May's inbox. Others who had noticed the smudge, heard the hum, felt the pull of something unseen. A former janitor confirmed the hidden door had existed once, long ago, but was sealed during a renovation he hadn't been allowed to finish. Another anonymous message simply read, "They told us to forget him. I never did." By the following day, local reporters had caught on. The story made the evening news, framed delicately as new developments in a cold case. The anchor's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. And behind her, the aerial footage of Dalton High looked like a crime scene from a distance. Wide shots of brick and mortar barely concealing what lay underneath. The police were forced to act. Pressure from outside law enforcement, from news outlets, from state officials who didn't like unanswered questions stacked 3 decades deep. The case was officially reopened, and Room 3B was cordoned off again. This time, it wasn't just tape, it was personnel, ground-penetrating scanners, legal paperwork. But the town didn't celebrate. Dalton resisted, like a body rejecting a transplant. Parents called school board meetings, not to demand justice, but to demand silence. Teachers avoided the subject entirely. Church sermons pivoted toward the dangers of rumor and the need for grace. The school's administration released a statement calling the investigation a tragic reawakening of trauma and pleaded for the community to come together rather than divide. And then the threat started. May found the first note taped to her locker. "Stop digging." That was all it said. The second came through her email, sent from a scrambled domain. "You think you've found something holy. It's not. Walk away." She stopped going to school in person, stayed home, locked her doors twice, slept with the lights on. But she didn't stop. Because by now, the truth was bigger than her. The posts had been mirrored, downloaded, discussed in forums and podcasts. It had a life now, a pulse. Even if someone wanted to bury it again, they'd have to bury the entire world. Still, May knew fear when it came knocking. It didn't need to scream. It came quiet, like everything else in Dalton. It came in the way her neighbors stopped making eye contact. In the way her phone rang once at 3 a.m. and then never again. In the way she noticed the same dark SUV parked down the block for 3 consecutive nights. The truth was out now, but so was something else. Something older. Something that had been sealed for a reason. And some doors, once opened, don't close without cost. They came in the early morning, just as the sun pulled itself over the hills, casting long, crooked shadows across the Dalton High parking lot. Maintenance vans, unmarked. 2 police cruisers parked quietly beside them. No sirens, no announcements. Just men in dark clothing, heads down, sleeves rolled. Their orders were simple. Clear the room, erase the board, and seal it shut. Room 3B had become a burden. Too many questions, too many headlines, too many whispers in hallways that had once been content to echo only bell tones and scraped sneakers. The school board had voted unanimously to retire the space. Not because they believed what had been said, but because they believed in control. And silence, in Dalton, was the best form of it. So the chalkboard was scrubbed one final time. Not wiped, scrubbed. They used industrial cleaner, soaked rags, and chemical solvents, stripping the slate until it gleamed like obsidian. The smudge that had defied 3 years of erasers disappeared beneath the force of their effort. They repainted the frame, sealed the cracks in the floor, bolted the windows shut. The desk was removed, the bookshelves emptied. When they left, the room no longer looked like a classroom. It looked like a cell. The next morning, the door was chained shut. A heavy lock hung from the handle. A new plaque read, "Closed for structural evaluation, do not enter." That should have been the end. But it wasn't. 2 nights later, the night custodian, an older man named Harold, who'd worked at the school since 1985, passed by the hallway on his final round. He didn't usually stop. The hallway lights flickered too often, and he'd long since learned not to look too closely at room 3B. But that night, something caught his eye. A light, just a sliver, glowing faintly beneath the door, like a candle flickering behind a closed curtain. He walked closer. Slowly. There was no sound, no movement. But when he reached the door and bent low, the light was gone. As if it had blinked out in the instant he saw it. He stood there a long moment, keys jangling in his fist, before turning away. He didn't report it. He didn't speak of it. He just left a note on the security desk saying, "Check 3B in the morning, something's off." When they opened the room again just briefly, just long enough to confirm there was no break-in. They found the chalkboard no longer clean. Words had returned. Written not in fresh chalk, but in the faint, crumbling residue of what had once been erased. A hand had pressed against the slate again. Letters uneven, small, urgent. She tried to help us. Don't stop now. There were no signs of entry, no footprints, no fingerprints. The lock had remained untouched. The room was resealed that same day. This time, they welded the door shut. Concrete was poured into the baseboards. Cameras were installed at either end of the hallway. The school said it was for safety, for peace of mind, for closure. But the students who walk past room 3B now don't believe that. They say the light still flickers under the door sometimes. They say if you press your ear to the wall, you can hear a voice reading softly. And the board, though hidden now, behind inches of plaster and paint, still waits. Because truth doesn't vanish. It only buries itself and waits to be read again.